Dungeon 42. By S. Jackson. Chapter 121. Eventual Issues. With a technically new and exciting issue on my hands, I started looking up information after awkwardly excusing myself from the future halfling settlement. There was an absolute brick of data on the subject of demons, but it was all the hearsay variety. I skipped to the factual description quickly. From there, I started taking down notes about the key points. Demon, as a term, encompasses 50 species of infernal origin. Each is distinct and tends toward chaos and neutrality, with only a few individuals embracing law. Evil is expected but not a mandated feature of the species. The majority are neutral in this respect. Traditionally, the term demon lord denotes individuals who have risen to power among their kind and achieved the highest leadership position. Those who manage to bring two or more species under their control would become known as demon kings. Currently, the system fills demon lord positions, and they combat each other to become king. I had to cull through quite a lot of information to get those main points together. The bit about them originating from an alternate plane was a topic that threatened to eat my brain if I let it. I hadn't thought too hard about planar cosmology despite accepting there were different realities which people like me were pulled from thoughts for another moment. The encyclopedia didn't give me any idea where said demons lived in relation to me nor their likely reaction to a dungeon. A less than ideal turn of events, but after a while, I just sighed and gave up. If they were hostile, the system would probably trigger a raid should they trespass into my domain. While the information indicated they were strong, that didn't mean they'd be a problem for me. On the contrary, they were another source of points unless I was missing something. The alignments might prove an issue, but I was hopeful since I wasn't listed as evil anymore. Mulling the pros and cons, I decided to leave things as they were but add a few security measures. I already had a quick block choke point for the forest side entrance. I made a point of reinforcing it and mapping out a new layout option. Next, the blue entry layer would need to be divided rather than continuous. I'd read that demons were naturally stronger than other species, even without class levels. So a separate teleporter and stair lobby would be waiting for them. The basics would be the same, but from the green layers down, the difficulty would rise much more quickly. Hard mode, as it were. All of this was easy to draw but would take time and testing to pull off. Still, since I was aware of a possible threat, it was best to plan for it. Pessimism was no one's friend. While I was working on the potential demon issue, Mirabella dropped in. Caught up in what I was doing, I quite literally hovered into her. I wondered if that was a feature of her prestige class of lore keeper or just a natural talent of library lovers. She was absurdly quiet, even for a halfling. "Oh, hey," I said, surprised to see her. The text had said the halflings liked my modified plan for their community. Outside of some aesthetic issues, anyway. "You seem calmer now, mistress," Mirabella offered with a grin. "Oh, good," I said, trying for an even tone. Mirabella had scared the crap out of me earlier, along with Hecha, but it hadn't seemed intentional on Hecha's part. The jury was still out on Mirabella. I came to propose we do the next round of layout tests at night. You mentioned before that colors shift despite being able to see perfectly in the dark. So while it's not ideal for choosing paint, it should be fine for testing layouts, Mirabella offered. "I was that bad, hey?" I asked. Mirabella bowed her head once in reply. I winced, but it wasn't unfair. I could be a bit reactive at times, but outside of when I'd thought another dungeon master appeared out of the blue when I got my appearance editing options, I usually wasn't that dramatic. I don't know why I got so anxious like that. We'll see how it goes. It might get better if I spend more time topside, and I wouldn't want it to get worse from giving in, I said after a moment. Managing it when I needed to go up was one thing. Avoiding it because it was uncomfortable was another. I didn't like the idea of eventually being trapped underground by fear, no matter how much control I had over the environment. "As you say," Mirabella said. "So, thinking about running a library or bookstore topside or happier down here? I asked. Mirabella was one of the newer skeletons since I hadn't focused on Bard prestige classes until much later, unlike the fighter options. I'm considering all options, but I prefer it in the crypts. I don't dislike my illusion, but I don't have much interest in mortal affairs anymore. At least outside of acquiring new academic information. Perhaps that will change, but I think I'll be content only occasionally going above to do research, Mirabella replied after a few beats of thought. Fair. I don't know that it needs anything formal management-wise, but if you like it enough or don't want to do raids, I can get a new lore keeper. One just for raids, and you can stick to the library, I offered. I still had positions to fill out, but I wasn't in a hurry for the moment. I doubted the demons would be coming in mixed parties with halflings. Thank you. I'll consider that as well, Mirabella said and gave a little bow. She left skipping, which mixed oddly with her relative formality when she spoke. Like a little kid trying to make sure all the grown ups knew they wouldn't steal cookies. It would clearly have to be the work of some less mature and intelligent child, no matter how many crumbs were around their mouth. Later, I got another set of texts when the mortal girls were done with their inspection. It seemed they approved of the setup in general. However, there was some confusion about where I expected all the wealthy merchants and lesser nobles to inhabit the homes I'd set would come from. Fuck, I muttered even as I laughed. It wasn't the first time my lack of local common sense had been brought to my attention. I'd just forgotten about it since it hadn't mattered before. I hadn't been on any kind of a clock. Mina was the only one who didn't think I'd gone overboard, but that wasn't a comfort under the circumstances. The girl from Full Dive VR Future Korea's perception of normal was not the best of benchmarks. I assured Hecha and Myra I'd try and make things a little less glaringly strange before the valley got any new guests. No sense in spooking people before they had a chance to settle in after all. Chapter 122. Old Wounds. A week after the model town showing, Hecha and Myra were ready to leave. I made a point of kitting them out with a limited set of reasonable quality gear on the horses I provided. They'd both looked at the good stuff with apprehension. It was nice enough it might inspire theft. Fortunately, that wasn't an issue. The decoy set would make them stand out less and look like ordinary travelers. They would simply access the good stuff through the inventory. They'd be able to use the best things I had to offer and wouldn't have to worry about extra weight. Make sure you don't drink the water, basically anywhere. Not unless you drop a purifier in it first, I cautioned over a call. They were departing just after dawn from the farm. I could have gone up to say goodbye but had decided against it. Not because of my anxiety. I simply doubted they wanted to see me in person. Understood, 42, Hecha replied. Also, if you get a chance, try it on seawater. I'm unsure whether it will remove the salt, separate it, or only clean up the other bits, I added. Alim could have tested that too, but he was staying rather firmly inland for the moment. We will, Hecha agreed, though she was hardly paying me any attention. Instead, she was looking around like something was missing. Forget something? I asked. No. I'm just not sure where Mina is, Hecha said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. I nodded at that. She hadn't made a fuss, but that didn't mean splitting up from her friends was easy for Mina. I'll be right back, I said and cut the call. Checking the map, I found Mina wasn't far. Or at least not outside of the valley. She'd gone to the model town and was playing checkers with Jeffrey, one of the human fighters. I watched this through the security feed and waited a few moments for their game to end before I called Mina. They'd been playing out on the porch of the future general store and had a small audience. Mina excused herself from the table and stepped into an alley between buildings before accepting. Hi, so, Hecha and Myra will leave in about half an hour. If you want to hang out in town until then, I can teleport you over when it's time, I offered in a bit of a rush. Subtlety wasn't my thing, and I didn't think trying to pry into her feelings would work out in my favor. Ah, right. I'll let you know, Mina said unenthusiastically. She didn't hang up, though, which I took as a sign that she wanted to talk. You know, there's something I've been meaning to ask you. If your Korea does it the same way as mine did, then your given name is June, Mina is your middle name, and Lee is your surname. Is that how it is? Or is Lee your first name because that's how it comes up over your head and how you signed the contract, Lee Mina June? I finally asked. It had been bugging me for a while, but I'd been concerned that asking would cause problems. People could be touchy about names. It seemed like a far less fraught point of discussion at the moment than what was going on. My given name is June, Mina replied with mild disbelief written across her features. Do you prefer Mina? I asked to cover my bases. It was honestly a bit of a pain in the ass any time I went to write their names. Not that it came up a lot. Still, if I mumbled a bit, it wasn't clear who I was talking about either. I don't mind it, but Mina is my middle name or, you know, my English name. My mom picked it in case I wanted to study abroad eventually, but I mostly used it when I was doing international streams, Mina explained. I nodded sagely, having a vague idea of what she meant and no genuine interest in an in-depth clarification. So you landed on Planet Renaissance Fair and decided to go with that? I asked out of curiosity. Phew, basically, Mina said with a long-suffering sigh. When I first arrived here, it was in a city of giant fucking weebs. So when I told them my name was Lee June, they misunderstood it as Lee Kun, like the honorific. Oof, I offered a sympathetic noise since I couldn't think of anything intelligent to say. Yeah, oof. No amount of explaining got them to change it, so I started going by Mina. Mina growled the first part and sighed the rest. Okay, so, would you rather I call you June? Or would it be Lihabai? I only half-ass know how honorifics work, I asked. Phew, that was nice to hear, Mina replied and laughed. So? I asked, trying to remind her she hadn't answered. Just June, thanks, June, formerly Mina, said with a grin. June it is, and you can just call me 42, I replied. Ah, I can't call you 42 Nim. June asked playfully. You can if you want, I said, having no investment in the subject. There were a few beats of silence, but it felt relatively comfortable. June also didn't take the opportunity to hang up, so I again assumed that meant she was still okay with talking. I'm scared I'll want to go with them, June said, apropos of nothing. Hey! I replied, eloquent as usual. With Myra and Hecha. I'm scared I'll feel the same urge I did before and follow them. We all tried to ditch each other a couple of times during our hero's quest, but it never worked. Even if we got away from each other for a while, we'd always catch up, June explained. Oh fuck, I said. This time it was definitely the appropriate response. Yet. It was the same thing with my name. I could have changed it, and I even tried when I first got to Stromholt. But, then those fuckers put the pendant on me, June continued. It was like my brain leaked out of my ear. I started thinking, doesn't Mina sound so much more proper and feminine? June explained, looking angrier as she went. By the end, she was a little red in the face as she snarled feminine. It's a girl's name in Korean, and it means talented, she added more calmly. Guess your mom had a premonition, I offered. June laughed at that, and some of the tension went out of her. She leaned against the side of the general store, looking exhausted in a way a 16-year-old shouldn't. You know. I like it here, but I can't just disappear on her. My dad was a piece of shit who bailed on us when I was young. So she raised me on her own, which wasn't easy, June offered. Well, for what it's worth, I hope you get back to her soon, I said honestly. Would you go back if you could? June asked me. The question caught me off guard. Honestly, no, I said after only a moment. I hadn't thought about it because it hadn't seemed like an option. Now that I was, the problem of subsisting on murder aside, I honestly didn't feel drawn to the idea. No? June asked. She seemed curious rather than judgmental as she did. No. As much as I'm not happy with my job, I'm pretty much God in my domain, and there's magic and fantasy stuff everywhere, I trailed off, organizing my thoughts. I'm not trading this for a return to the subsistence living gig job hellscape I came from. I only remembered my last few minutes of life before I died. The inciting incident, if you would. It was enough when combined with the factual information I could recall. If I got the option to switch to a different job, I might consider it, but that was all. Even then, I wasn't sure if I'd want to make the change. As much as I didn't like having to pay a tithe, I liked the powers I had. 42, could you do me a favor? Teleport me over, but don't let me leave with them, even if I try to insist. June asked. It broke me out of my reverie, and I nodded immediately. Yeah, June. I can do that, I said simply. Chapter 123. 2 steps back, and 1 to the left. Once Myra and Hetcha departed, June took the opportunity to join Andrea for training. Henry had enough fighter levels to accommodate them, but Roxolana showed up to help with sparring. It was interesting to watch when I could spare a moment. Given I knew jack shit about fighting, I left the training to the professionals in all aspects. Henry broke June away from Andrea after a week and started having her spar against other classes. Andrea was the more driven of the two, but June seemed to be making better overall progress. Henry also continued to make an effort to control his stuttering, to varying degrees of success. A process I didn't comment on because speech therapy was another blind spot of mine. I knew of it, but not how it was done. With the agreement to have an honest talk once June left already in place, we hadn't spoken much. That was still an improvement over not talking at all, however. Once June was off and training on her own, Andrea doubled down. Naturally, I expected that to have unfortunate results eventually and alerted Henry. He talked to Andrea, but she wasn't dissuaded. Within a week, Andrea tore a tendon in her leg. An injury that might well have been debilitating under normal circumstances. I wouldn't have known about it if not for the potion distribution alert. I still needed to get used to the bubbling noise it made. I found Andrea in the training room alone. It was hours after Henry had concluded her lessons for the day. Well past when she should have stopped independent conditioning. Teleporting in, I had a very long speech about self-care planned. Andrea easily could have suffered alone for hours, given how isolated her room was from everything else. My carefully planned words and stern but compassionate demeanor were forgotten as I materialized. My hands went straight to my ears as a shrill wail filled them. Andrea was on the ground, sword still in hand and sweating from the pain as she took a bottle to her lips with her free hand. I'd known she was hurt, but how much pain it caused hadn't been something I'd given any thought to. I was used to functionally immortal monsters able to respawn and my questionable biology. Being reminded of the wet horror of a living human body was jarring. As much as I missed sensation at times, I couldn't say I was excited to ever end up writhing on the ground with a torn tendon. Andrea managed to gulp down some of the potion finally. The bottle was shaped like an anatomical diagram of the muscle of a leg from ankle to knee and filled with pale amber liquid. It seemed to help with the pain, and she went from ashen to something approaching a normal healthy color. You're going to rest for a couple of days, I said. Andrea choked on the potion she was in the process of drinking and sputtered. She was still having trouble moving, but managed to turn over and get into a sitting position, sword up and potion clutched defensively to her chest. Then, seeing me, she relaxed fractionally. What? Andrea asked. Finish that first, I said, gesturing at the bottle. Andrea nodded and chugged the potion. As for what I said, you're going to take a training break, I explained. I held up a hand to forestall any comment on Andrea's part. Rather than explain a bunch of sports medicine concepts I only vaguely understood, I just opened a window to show her the security feed of her training. Even sped up considerably, it was easy to see how the injury occurred. Andrea had started out fine, but her movements became labored as time passed. Finally, her form grew sloppy as fatigue overtook her. I slowed the footage to regular speed a few moments before she twisted her leg so she could see just how bad it was before that first ear-splitting shriek of pain. I thought I'd heard the worst of it when I arrived, but that had nothing on that first one. You overworked yourself. You're going to take a couple of days off and do only minimal conditioning before you train again. Once you do, you're going to stick to the schedule Henry or Roxolana assigns you, I said flatly. Why does it matter? The potion fixed it, Andrea demanded, visibly confused. Because it won't make you stronger. Yeah, the potion healed you, but it might have wiped out the muscle gains you've been trying for, I explained. Until Andrea's strength or constitution ticked up on her stats, I'd have no idea if her training was working. Even then, I wouldn't know if the potion set her back. Stats didn't have experience bars to track. You can't, really? Andrea asked, frustration and fear blooming. She moved carefully to stand up and face me. I still loomed over her, even at her full height. Hopefully not, but it's possible. Your muscles get stronger by healing back from the damage exercise causes. You have to rest properly for that to happen. Potions might well wipe that out without improving anything, I offered to clarify. Fuck. Andrea hissed. Her sword glowed blue as she hurled it across the room. It flew in a lopsided and inelegant spin but decapitated a training dummy. I didn't react but realized I'd functionally clenched my entire body for a moment only when it started to relax. The display of power and temper had been a little scary though Andrea couldn't attack me. My body also wasn't terribly important, all things considered, even discounting that it was indestructible. My core was the vulnerable part of me. You're trying to catch up with June, I offered after a moment. Andrea glared but then pulled it back to something sulky and thankfully less murderous. I'm higher level, but she's doing better than I am, Andrea admitted. Did Henry or Roxolana say that? I asked. No, Andrea said after a moment. Ask them about it then. They'll have a reason, and it might surprise you, I offered. Of course, I'd assumed the same thing as Andrea from my casual observations. That didn't mean I was right, though. What if I'm right? Andrea asked, temper flaring again. Does it matter? I countered. What? Andrea asked, clearly caught on the back foot. We made a deal. I'm not going to back out of it just because you're struggling a little. If you even are. Honestly, they might be speeding up her training because she's leaving soon, not because she's doing better, I added. The idea pulled firmly out of my tail. I hadn't asked how the training was going. I didn't have anything helpful to offer on that point. That didn't change the fact it was entirely possible. Oh, Andrea said, confusion deepening. I wondered if she'd forgotten about that we were bound by a contract rather than a simple promise. Relax, all right? It's going to take time, but I'm contractually obligated to make sure you get stronger, I added to drive the point home. Okay, Andrea said finally. She looked a bit sheepish, and I, taking care not to surprise her, patted her on the shoulder. She looked more than a little weirded out by that, but she hadn't screamed. So I chalked that up as a win. Cool, so 3 days minimum conditioning, then you follow Henry or Roxolana's directions for training. That's an order, I said. Andrea smiled and nodded. I figured I had about a week before she tried to weasel out of it and overwork herself, but I smiled back anyway. Chapter 124. Dramatic Introductions. Chris. Would you please be Andrea's training partner? I feel like you two might get along. Let me know what you think when you get a chance. -42. Chris looked the message over for the third time since he'd received it. The words weren't complicated. 42 was aware of his less than ideal level of literacy. She'd been the one to teach him, after all. The issue Chris was having was in fathoming the idea itself. The street rat assassin would get along with a noble lady. However minor the title had been, the mental gymnastics his mistress would have had to do to come up with the idea seemed staggering. So, Miss Priss refuses to take lessons from you now, or what? Chris asked. He'd been loitering in the workroom of Henry's crypt for nearly a half hour. Something the other man tolerated as long as he didn't touch anything. The missing bones of his fingertips, which he'd lost to a ruler of all things, were proof of the severity of the consequences. No. Andrea behaves quite well. She's simply lost some of her motivation as June will be leaving soon, Henry replied. Oh, so I'm to be her plaything then, Chris growled. He'd been a lot of things, but he'd never had the particular misfortune of being a companion, as they were called. Some of them ended up being treated in ways that made even him shudder. Rich people got up to some properly strange shit at times. Henry stopped pinning whatever he was working on and turned to face Chris properly. Chris, she's a 16-year-old girl from some provincial bit of nowhere. I sincerely doubt she has a taste for playthings. I wouldn't teach her if that were likely, Henry said and sighed. Monkey on a leash for the aristo girl, Chris countered. You're too ill-mannered for a pet, Henry shot back. Chris flipped him off. Henry just snorted at that, unimpressed as usual. Why me then? 42 must have a reason, Chris said finally. He didn't like to admit to his curiosity. It suggested unease. Weakness. Something he'd had drilled into him that he could not risk showing for any reason. Not that he had to worry about dying anymore. Beyond already having done it once, respawning took away even the minor anxiety of wondering where he'd end up next. Not to disparage her, but 42 might well think it's enough that you're close in age, Henry said with a shrug. That's it? Chris asked. He was equal parts astonished and appalled at the idea, but it did fit 42 in a way. She operated on an internal logic that none bothered claiming to understand. You'd be her sparring partner, Chris, not her etiquette teacher. I think you'll manage just fine, Henry said and laughed. What if I just don't want to? Chris asked sullenly. He understood he was a bit much, but Henry wasn't helping. 42 won't force you to keep doing it, if you try and don't like it. I doubt she'll even force you to try, Henry said, pausing for a moment. Even I wouldn't honestly blame you if you don't. I wasn't keen on the idea, but 42 asked, so I decided to see how it went. You just want in her good books, Chris said sullenly. He kept the and her knickers thought to himself. He didn't feel like respawning for the moment. Yes, truly one of my greatest character flaws, Henry said, rolling his jewels. Chris departed without saying anything further, more unsettled than when he'd gone looking for advice. Henry hadn't said anything wrong so far as he could tell, but it still nagged at him. He didn't have to do it, could stop if he tried and didn't like it, and Andrea was probably fine as far as noble girls went. It sounded easy, and easy never sat well with him. Despite his misgivings, Chris headed to the necropolis's teleportation circle hub with mischief on his mind. Since he'd been asked, he might as well look in on this Andrea girl, if nothing else. Arriving in an unfamiliar hallway, Chris was immediately on alert, his stealth ability going. Finding a door, he carefully eased it open and peered into a training room. A red-haired girl had her back to him as she ran through a drill. It was pure foolishness to train like that, her back unguarded, but it let him slip in easily. As always, the space had a dramatic design to it. Sconces holding light stones lined the walls consistently, with banners hung between them for color. All of it drew the eye up to the high ceiling, which had rafters for some arcane reason. 42 really did like to embellish everything, no matter how unneeded it was, which was half the reason Chris was fond of her. Other people would probably find it pretty, but Chris found 42's taste for elaborate designs just plain useful. Using a banner and a sconce, he was up in the rafters without even needing the bit of thin cord on his belt to help. In his opinion, if 42 had been the one designing buildings in Jarlensberg, he'd have been able to give the Graveman a run for his money body count-wise. Everything she made was an assassin's paradise. Rather than move to do anything just yet, Chris took the opportunity to study Andrea. He didn't know what he'd been expecting when he found out a living girl had sought to make a deal with 42. The other one, June, he'd seen, and she had features of a mundane but rarely seen type. It was the kind of face you wouldn't be surprised belonged to a hero. This one looked like pretty much every well-to-do girl he'd ever seen. A bit soft but healthy, Andrea was someone who'd been looked after well but was otherwise unremarkable. The only thing that stood out about her was the red hair trailing behind her as she moved from a high tail and the ferocity of her strikes. Dull-eyed and desperate sweat was running down her face in rivulets. It wasn't how someone practicing should look. In Chris's experience, even most men in a fight didn't look so harried. They also didn't generally have smooth skin or a full set of teeth. Chris mused on their differences as he swung his legs over the side of the beam he sat on. It shouldn't have mattered, but Chris wondered if Andrea's hands were as soft as the rest of her looked. If they'd bear the full mark of the grueling training it took to make it to a prestige class or only bore light calluses. He wanted to see if her hands had been gloved and carefully tended to keep them appropriate to a lady. Chris thought of his face, but not the one he was wearing. That one, the illusion, only had some of the old goblin to it. His true face, the one he'd worn when he died, hadn't been pretty. It had borne the weight and scars of the long years spent learning his craft and hard living. A beast in a man's skin and the milk-soft girl below him. What exactly 42 thought was remotely similar about them entirely escaped Chris. The question writhed in his mind like an enraged serpent, refusing to be ignored and irritating him further as he tried and failed to answer it. Worse, despite him not bothering to hide, Andrea hadn't noticed him a mere 10 feet above her. The girl was sloppy, hopelessly sloppy. When his irritation became unbearable, Chris dropped from the rafter. He landed just behind Andrea rather than on her. One arm snaked around her throat while the other pressed a dagger to her abdomen. Ah! Andrea shrieked in surprise. She moved fast, but she wasn't Henry. When Andrea tried to throw Chris off, he stabbed her in the thigh as a parting gift. He hit the ground and rolled back to his feet. Andrea had tried to use a movement ability, not yet feeling the blade in her leg. She did a split second later and hit the ground hard as it gave way. She tumbled a few times, propelled by the energy of the technique she'd been trying to use. Andrea's sword flew out of her hand, and she came to a stop on her back. She was already rolling over into a limping crawl, intent on getting her weapon back. It was a better instinct than most would have, but still dismal since Chris was already up and dashing at her. Chris booted Andrea in the ribs, sending her down on her back again. Again, she pushed up, scrambling back but not toward her weapon this time. Another mistake. A kind of frisson filled the air, and a little glass bottle appeared in Andrea's hand, a potion. Her hand closed on the potion too quickly for Chris to kick it away. He settled for stomping on her fist hard enough to shatter it. She screamed, and there was a noise like thunder. Christopher Truman phalanges. 42's voice echoed through the training hall. That's me. Want to train together? Chris asked, tone mockingly polite. He even bowed as he offered her a hand up. As if 42's shout was fanfare rather than a dire warning. After all, if one were going to pour oil on the fire, they might as well use the whole jug. Do not ignore me. 42 growled. The words were followed by a hand like a velvet glove grasping Chris by his very spine. Scruffed like a puppy, he couldn't do anything but hang limply from her grasp. Chris did his best to look casual, crossing his arms and holding still rather than flailing. Andrea 42 started but trailed off. Andrea was busy drinking a potion, shards of glass from the first one pushing from the wound in her hand as she did. It was strange to watch, but Chris thought it was interesting. This was the first time he'd seen a potion work up close. "I want to train with him," Andrea said once she was done drinking. "You do?" 42 and Chris asked together. "I'll learn more from him than Henry," Andrea said. 42 let Chris go, though it was questionable if it were intentional or a matter of shock. "Seriously?" 42 asked. Chris took the opportunity to step forward, his hand going out. Andrea misunderstood it for another offer to help her up. Right until his hand bypassed hers, grabbing the knife's hilt and jerking it free. Andrea shrieked, the hook tip adding injury to injury, though the potion quickly healed it. "Chris!" 42 hissed. "So, you think I'll be a better teacher than Henry?" Chris asked conversationally with an unfriendly smile. He wiped his dagger clean before sheathing it again. "What? No. Just a better sparring partner. Henry won't fight dirty," Andrea explained. Chris took that in, his expression blank for a moment before bursting into a braying peal of laughter. "What?" Andrea asked, looking to 42 for an answer. 42 just shook her head, having no idea what Chris found amusing. "I'm being serious. He wins every match, but he's entirely by the book. That isn't going to help me against less principled fighters," Andrea offered. "Love, he dusts me every time we fight. He's not using dirty tricks because he doesn't bloody need them against you." Chris managed to pause his laughter long enough to deliver the news in a back slap. "I know that!" Andrea shouted. Chris took a step back, surprised not by the volume so much as the vehemence. He'd struck a nerve. "Andrea, is this about what happened with June again?" 42 asked, hands up placatingly and tone gentle. "No. It's about the fact I'll never catch up to that crazy bastard even in 6 lives. I've seen him fight the others, I need to learn to fight actual people, not whatever he is," Andrea said, her howl of anger turning into frustrated tears. "Oh, well. 42 said, caught flat-footed to all appearances. "Just leave me be!" Andrea shrieked. "All right, but call me later when you feel like talking," 42 said before melting into the very air. Chris found himself the last man standing in the aftermath as Andrea collapsed to her knees. On an academic level, he was aware he should probably leave. He'd introduced himself by ambushing and stabbing the girl. It wasn't likely that she'd welcome his lingering, but he didn't feel the urge to just yet. He was an assassin when he was alive. He switched classes here, Chris offered a few moments later. Andrea was still crying, but she was out of the racking sobs part and into the sniffling portion of them. She didn't look up, her cheek pressed against her knees as she hugged them. "So?" Andrea asked after a bit. "So he made a career out of tearing other classes apart, and he was good at it from what I can tell," Chris admitted. It was one of the reasons why he minded his tongue around Henry considerably more than anyone else. Andrea looked up at him, clearly waiting for him to say something further. "So, is that really all that's got you so bent?" he asked. "What do you mean?" Andrea asked, a little hostility flaring in her eyes and tone. Eyes that would have been a lively green if not for the desperation dulling them. "Well, you've been training less than a month. Seems a bit soon to be declaring yourself 6 lifetimes behind just because Henry can whip your ass still," Chris offered. Andrea sat up properly to glare at him. Chris found he liked her better irritated than depressed. "Did 42 not tell you what happened?" Andrea asked with genuine confusion underlying the anger. Chris made a rolling gesture with his hand to encourage her to continue. "My father sold me like a fucking cow," Andrea growled, getting to her feet. "My mum was sold to a brothel," Chris countered, circling as Andrea took a step toward him. He didn't understand what point she was trying to make. "What?" Andrea asked, eyes round in surprise. "People get sold, you know? I was a slave briefly once myself," Chris offered with a shrug. They weren't happy memories, but he wouldn't call them sad either. Sad was hunger and unrelenting cold that seeped into the bones as if it would never leave. Chris's master had been a man with a taste for blood and cultivated the kind of friends who liked to see it up close rather than the polite distance afforded by a coliseum. Close enough to spatter on their faces even. Being a slave to that man meant a warm bed, food, and the odd bit of back alley fighting. Not pleasant, certainly not desirable, but not a sad thing by Chris's reckoning. "That's horrible," Andrea said, sounding shocked still. Chris scratched at his false hair, fingertips scraping bone. He understood that Andrea couldn't know she was antagonizing him. He could handle scorn, but pity was intolerable to him. Normally it wouldn't have mattered to Chris, but something about Andrea was getting to him in an unfamiliar way. His mortal life was little more than a story. A story he'd read so many times he knew by heart. One that didn't tell him how he'd felt about much of anything but included facts he shouldn't know. Things like his mother's name and which of her regulars had been his father. It was what it was, Chris said with a shrug. Responding beyond that would give too much away. It was better to let her off in his mind than display weakness, particularly since the alternative was distracting her with some other aspect of the story, things like the parts of his life he did fondly recall. The smell of the ocean, the taste of bread Chris used to steal from old Nan's kitchen occasionally when the eagle-eyed crone was distracted. The color his master's face had turned when Chris strangled him to death. Those were a bit too personal. Well, I just feel so stupid. He'd spent years telling me I couldn't learn to fight, then he finally seemed to accept it. To see that I had the skill and the drive to become an adventurer. I was fucking honored when he put that mind control necklace on me himself, Andrea explained and laughed bitterly. Chris was caught off guard by the confession. "What? Nothing rude to say?" Andrea asked playfully. Chris found he'd been incorrect. She looked even better with a smile than she had when annoyed. His mind churned for a moment as he considered what she'd said. "3 things, Chris said finally. "Go on then. Nothing stopped you from stabbing me, so what's a few words?" Andrea asked even as she took up a more guarded stance. A wise thing to do, in Chris's opinion. Not that it would help in this case. Who's to say he wasn't mind-controlled or threatened too? "Possibly with the rest of your family's lives," Chris offered, holding a non-middle finger up to tick off the first point. It was a conscious courtesy on his part. "Second, I say that because a man so against you being an adventurer wasn't likely to welcome you becoming a hero. If he thought it was improper, then having you become someone recognized the kingdom over would have been parading dirty laundry in public. Something nobles usually don't do," Chris said as the second finger went up. Andrea's mouth opened slightly, then closed without a word as the color drained from her face. "Third, even if he did that, how do you know it wasn't sincere? You're assuming he was in on it with the church. Yet, how would he know if they didn't tell him, and he's not a mage?" Chris asked. Andrea looked at him in shock, her mind the one in turmoil as she tried to make sense of what he'd said. "That? Why say any of that? Why do you care?" Andrea asked, tone heavy but free of accusation. "Can't say that I do," Chris replied. "Liar," Andrea countered hotly. "Honestly, I'm an assassin, love. I killed strangers professionally," Chris informed her. Then, pulling a small throwing knife from his wrist holster, he did a few tricks with it for emphasis. Some adventurers took up the class but didn't practice it professionally. Chris wanted to make the truth clear to Andrea before they spoke further. "That's not what I asked you," Andrea countered. Chris sighed at her inability to fabricate whatever answer would suit her. He preferred it when people did, since it saved him the trouble of lying further or, worse, having to tell the truth. "It's eating at you, the idea you have to kill your father. Now, you have options," Chris said as the knife disappeared back into its sheath. Andrea didn't seem in the mood for that kind of distraction. "You can think about it more. Make a plan to find out more. Maybe just leave it be and decide what to do when the moment comes." Chris offered. Andrea frowned distrustfully at him but was listening. All of which is a sight better than exhausting yourself trying to convince yourself it's the only option, Chris explained. He'd seen it before when someone decided they'd been screwed over in love or money. They'd get the idea in their head that the debt had to be paid with blood and ruin themselves trying to get up the courage to do it. Andrea's mistrust lingered, and Chris could see her on the verge of a new question. Something he'd rather not have to hear if he wasn't off the mark. She was looking at him too gently for it to be anything tolerable. Which also wouldn't be any of my business, but you're taking up attention I'd prefer to have, Chris added, barely holding in a wince. That was more honest than he liked to be, but he knew the value of using it strategically. He was honestly sick of 42 worrying about and doting on Andrea and knew the sincerity of it would come through in his words. He also wasn't fond of how much attention Henry paid her either, but Chris wouldn't admit to that, even under torture. Seriously, you got so jealous I was taking up your mum's attention that you stabbed me? Andrea asked, flatly shocked. She's not my mum. Chris hissed. Of course not, Christopher Truman Phalanges, Andrea said with that weird inflection people used with babies. Chris shoved her for that and found her pushing him back. That escalated quickly and soon they were rolling on the floor. Chris's hand laced in Andrea's hair to pull it viciously until she broke 3 of his ribs with a speed-enhanced knee slam. "Aw fuck!" Andrea hissed as tears streamed out of her eyes. She'd done herself an injury in the process, but Chris didn't retaliate. He was too close to respawning. Instead, they both lay on the ground, her clutching her knee and him poking at the knife-sharp bone fragments now ruining his shirt. "Whinge to someone who doesn't know you'll fix it with a potion," Chris said testily. "Fuck off, you don't even feel pain," Andrea shot back, then drank her potion. She lay on the floor for a few minutes, just breathing. "If I still want to train with you, will you agree?" Andrea asked. "Didn't take you for a masochist," Chris replied, genuinely surprised. They both laughed at that, and he pushed up and off the floor. Stepping over to Andrea, he offered her a hand up, and she made the ill-advised decision to accept it. "Train with me, please," Andrea requested once she was on her feet. Chris had half a mind to illustrate how it was a terrible idea but just stepped away, turning his back. He paused before he'd gotten more than a pace. "Sure, love," Chris said finally. A tingle ran down his spine as he said it. A sailor he'd known in life had called girls that and men lads. He did well with the ladies too, so Chris had taken to copying him but hadn't used it since becoming a skeleton. "Not today, though, things to do," he added. A respawn was in order, but he wanted to check in on Blackmore and the puppies before he did. Hopefully, after that, he'd be able to shake off the disquiet he felt. It shouldn't have mattered that he'd called Andrea love. It was just a word he'd used to make the ladies giggle when he flirted. "Until next time, then," Andrea replied. Chris gave her a thumbs up without turning back to look at her and started whistling a cheerful tune. Either he'd be sorted out by the time he saw her again, or he was well and truly in trouble. Underscore 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 un. Chapter 125. Au revoir. For a month, June split her time between the dungeon for training and the farmhouse in the valley. Unlike Andrea, she couldn't deal with living inside the dungeon, no matter how nice the accommodations were. After getting used to her improvements and tweaks to her class, June moved out of general practice and into practical use. That training was divided between fighting other classes individually and participating in group fights. The latter was the most fun. She was paired up in a party with the skeletons in random assortments and would then fight another group. When she found out about the betting, June was pissed and demanded that Dawn give her a cut. Thanks to that, she had a small sack of the chips the skeletons used. She squirreled some of them as keepsakes. Being allowed to join in on the raid league didn't happen until Jun's last week in the dungeon. It was truly a wild experience to do a mock raid with the monsters normally tasked with defending the place. Something they did for fun in their free time normally. To keep things fresh, 42 had shaken up the layout enough that the skeletons were coming in cold too. So they fought and stumbled through the various traps, puzzles, and flights together. Given that most adventurers only ever fought in 2 or 3 in an entire career, June knew she'd picked up some invaluable experience getting to do it so many times. Still, the fun had to end, and truthfully, June wasn't sad to know she'd be leaving soon. So on the last day, she didn't have training but still popped into the dungeon to say her goodbyes to everyone. Some of them were sweet, and plenty were just polite. Chris made a rude but sweet, for him, joke that she'd make a good skeleton if not for all the meat. The last goodbye was the only one that was a bit difficult for June. With her and Andrea off for the day, she eventually found Henry working on a project in his crypt. One of the more avant-garde ones that looked more like filigree than a construct of leather. "Miss June," Henry said, bowing slightly to be polite. "All packed, I hope." "Yeah," June said, and it wasn't entirely a lie. She still needed to double-check some things, but it would be fine. "I wanted to make sure I said bye before I left. You've helped me so much, and I wanted you to know that I appreciate it," June said. "You've shown me that already with your diligence, but thank you," Henry replied. "Also. Okay. I appreciate the fighter training but those clothes you made me are fucking awesome. Back home, you'd have been like, couture. Just the best of the best, and I wanted you to understand I will figure out a way to drag them through whatever portal I end up going home through," June said in a rush. She'd been holding that in for a while, the pure glee at being given not just handmade but beautifully detailed clothes. At home, June had lived in t-shirts and jeans but not for want of a personal sense of fashion. Her taste was ridiculously expensive, so she'd never bothered to dress up. Now she had a bag full of clothes that would cost as much as a down payment on a car. "You appreciate the clothes more than your training?" Henry asked with just a hint of disbelief in his tone. "I appreciate both. The training was fun," June said, blushing furiously. Henry laughed, breaking the tension, and patted her on the shoulder. "There's nothing wrong with preferring non-lethal displays of skill," Henry said, stumbling on his words as he continued laughing. "Thanks. Thanks for everything, Henry Sunseng Nim," June said when her embarrassment finally subsided enough to let her speak. Henry just nodded at that. "My best wishes for your success, Miss June," Henry replied. June nodded, then turned and left, her cheeks still feeling like they were on fire. She didn't stop until she was back in the top layer and headed out for the farmhouse. It was still early morning, but she couldn't linger anymore. Heading back took a while, but when June arrived, the person waiting for her at the farmhouse was 42. It was something that still surprised her even though they'd agreed to meet before she left. An agreement June should have turned up earlier to fulfill, but 42 graciously didn't say anything about it. Rather than explain anything, June got busy double-checking her bag of supplies, just in case. It was mainly a set piece rather than a necessity but needed the right stuff in it for a trip. Otherwise, she might draw unwanted attention since she'd use her access to the item box for most things. The item box, which was a result of Jun's contract with 42. The weird shadow monster hovering off to one side like a mom whose kid was about to go on their first overnight trip. It was equal parts creepy and endearing. "All good?" 42 asked. "Yep, I'm totally set. Just need to collect my whip, and I'm good," June joked. She looked around the farmhouse's living room where she'd spent the past month. She wouldn't miss it exactly, but she'd definitely miss how comfortable it was. "June, did you name the horse Nene?" 42 asked suspiciously. "Maybe," June lied. She hadn't thought up a name for the horse but didn't mind using that one. She considered herself pretty good at naming things, but 42 had a flair for it. June got one of the weird gust of wind pats on the back for that, along with the privilege of hearing 42's unnerving laughter. Like two different people doing a villain chuckle, just slightly out of sync. "Stay weird, kid," 42 offered once she stopped laughing. "Will do," June said, chuckling a little herself. She put the pack on and then headed for the farmhouse door, only to pause. 42, about Andrea, June trailed off, trying to think of what to say. Andrea had made her call, and June had her own deal. Despite that, she was still worried. It would have been easy for Andrea to change the terms of her deal when they weren't looking. "Take care of her, okay?" June asked. It was not lost on her that she was asking the monster they'd both made a contract with to do it. She was also aware said monster had the decency not to let Andrea run straight back to Stromhold in her own doom just because she wanted to. It was stupid, but between Andrea and 42, the shadow monster had the better common sense. 42 didn't say anything in reply, just gave a little bow that June returned. Of course, the angle was wrong, and 42's tail lashed weirdly, which thoroughly ruined the solemn effect. Still, it was the thought that counted. June barely made it out of the door before a blue blur ambushed her. Andrea, who'd been missing all morning, grabbed her in a hug. One that threatened to drive the wind out of June. June just hugged her back and laughed. It was bittersweet to be leaving the last of her friends from the Cursed Heroes party, but she was determined to ensure it wasn't a goodbye, just an until we meet again. She'd see her again, at least once, before she found her way home. She would make sure of it. Chapter 126. Dire Frivolities. Henry. "I'd like for us to talk. Let me know when you have the time. -42. The text was simple, and I'd sent it shortly after June departed from the valley. We'd already agreed, but Henry had wanted to wait until I was less distracted by everything going on with the former heroes party. It was a good call, but one that had left me a bit anxious as Jun's training had drawn it out more than I had expected. 42. "I'd like to do so tonight. Henry." The response was quick, and I was glad for that, even if I wasn't exactly looking forward to the wait. It wasn't that long, but enough for me to stew. I did my best to stay busy and even finished some work. However, as the hour I expected Henry to text me again approached, I started getting suitably nervous. It wasn't as if we hadn't seen each other since then. We still spoke pretty regularly, but it had been different. Closer to how things should have started, more businesslike but not unfriendly. Most of my relationships with the skeletons were like that, aside from with Henry, Chris, and Dawn. When my doorbell rang, I found a letter rather than Henry himself. It contained a drawing of my overlook, and I transported myself there. He was waiting on the bench, a few faint lights twinkling in the demonstration town below. The real show was above us, the night sky a rich tapestry of twinkling stars. 42, Henry said as he stood up. He gave me a reserved bow, and I did a little mock curtsy in reply, which got him to laugh. Some of the tension I'd felt drained out of me. Despite the fairly formal greeting, his posture was relaxed. "Henry," I trailed off, my planned words failing me. It was easy to imagine a conversation. However, it was much more challenging to articulate my thoughts without jamming my tail in my mouth. "You read the letter and had time to think about it. How? How do you want to proceed?" Henry asked. "I have no idea," I admitted. That seemed to catch Henry on the back foot, but he seemed confused rather than offended. "I like you because of who you are now and the choices you've made here. That letter, what happened, and what you didn't change that," I said bluntly. I'd told Henry that much before I'd read it, that my feelings were due to the current circumstances. Henry was speechless for a moment before sighing. "Icarus told me I was being an idiot, but..." "You don't care?" Henry asked. It made me want to cry and strangle your shitbag father, but that's it, I said honestly. I genuinely hoped that guy lived and died miserably for what he'd done. Henry groaned, a hand going to his face. It didn't cover much since it was bone, but I could understand the feeling behind it. Dawn said I was being weird about it too. It occurred to me a little late I might be influencing you without realizing it. The dungeon, its denizens, how I think and feel plays a pretty big role in how everything works, I explained. The hounds and skeletons wouldn't have been able to talk if I didn't want them to. Ability be damned. From what I've experienced, you're not incorrect, but it's not particularly subtle when it happens, Henry said. She mentioned that I could probably change your behavior but not your actual feelings, I admitted. But it still makes you uncomfortable, Henry summarized. I just nodded at that. It was true and probably always would be. That aside, are you okay with how things are? That I can order you to do things, to summon you? I may not have done or asked anything of you that you find disagreeable yet, but I could, I asked. Henry probably knew better than I did what a dungeon master could really do to a summoned monster if they wanted to. There was a heavy pause, and I fought an urge to say something to end the conversation and run off. If Henry needed a minute to think or get up the courage to say something I wouldn't want to hear, he deserved it. Being what I am, a tool for dungeon masters didn't particularly bother me when it first happened. I thought it was something akin to punishment for my deeds in life. Later I realized it was simply strange circumstances. That even if it were in some way part of a divine machination, it had nothing to do with me personally, Henry began. That was a little humiliating, but I moved past it. So here and now? I'd do as you asked of me even without your powers because I've come to like you a great deal. I also suspect I find quite a lot less distasteful than you seem to assume. I was an assassin, and I was very good at what I did as much because I enjoyed it as the necessity of ensuring my survival, Henry explained. I got the feeling from your letter that you liked the technical side of it. Of figuring out how to get at a target and how to take down other classes, I offered. Henry hadn't gone into detail, but he'd mentioned things like that while he never mentioned gore or any joy in the killing itself. Why yes, Henry said. But you chose to be a chevalier here, I said. An old dream of mine. One that didn't mean I couldn't use my old KN knowledge, Henry said with what felt like a smirk. I could change your class, and you wouldn't be able to stop me, I pointed out. Henry might not care about all the heinous shit I could order him to do to others, but that would matter to him. He nodded but didn't speak immediately. If that happened, if you became the kind of person who would, I'd cease to love you. Whatever I'd do afterward would be an illusion you constructed yourself, Henry said simply. I nodded, caught off guard but accepting what he'd said. Right, but... I struggled for a moment as I tried to think of what to say. The point I'd been getting at was that I had the ability. My absolute lack of interest in doing so was beside the point. Aaron would have been first up on the list of people whose class I'd change if it were simply a question of utility. Dawn told me about your idea of imbalance of power in a relationship being problematic. It's part of why I asked to delay this discussion, Henry said. Another sucker punch, but one I was glad of. I'd been trying to convey that, but I knew I could have done a better job. So believe me when I say I am aware but still want you, he added. I opened my mouth to say something, then closed it again. Most of the points I'd constructed had been torn to shreds. So I dug around in my memories to come up with new ones. I couldn't think of a situation where I clearly influenced Henry off the top of my head. Even when he'd kissed me, I'd been surprised. I'd already started to like him but hadn't thought about our relationship becoming that kind of physical. As I'd proved with the other skeletons, I was a tactile dumbass. I liked physical affection but didn't give it a lot of thought. It hadn't occurred to me that it might mean more to him initially. I want you to, I said finally. Gods of good, Henry said in relief. All tension went out of him as he leaned against the shelter post like he needed the support. "Wow, you okay?" I asked as I rushed over. I put a hand on his shoulder as I looked into his jewels, the instinct probably a leftover from my previous life. Fantastic," Henry said, laughing. "I thought you might refuse for my own good and wasn't looking forward to trying to talk you out of it." Yet, I was thinking about it. Only it occurred to me that I had probably misunderstood exactly how soon you became interested in me, I admitted. Of course, there were still problems with the situation, but I couldn't claim I didn't think Henry wasn't deciding to go for it himself. If I were really setting the pace, we probably wouldn't even be doing more than hugging each other as a hello. If it was after the first day we met, you misjudged it badly, Henry said. Wait, seriously? I thought New Year's at the absolute earliest, I said, not quite believing him. It had become more than interest by then, Henry countered, his hands settling on my hips. I laughed at that as he pulled me closer. Oh, going to tell me you thought I was pretty? I asked playfully. Gorgeous, Henry countered as he leaned in for a kiss. He was either being sweet or had fucked up taste, but I was fine with either answer and kissed him back. Chapter 127. Home and Hearth. I was in a fantastic mood for a week after Henry and I got back together. As I finished the major expansion to the lava area, everything felt like it was flowing for a change. After Blackmore's difficulty during her pregnancy, it had been foremost on my mind. Now mother and pups all seemed in good health, and I was back to my regularly scheduled dungeon routine. One that was amended to include a more aggressive purchase schedule for the lava area than before. Buddy, Pounce, and Hestia seemed to be doing fine, but that could change as they grew. The fact I was flying blind concerning the pups might have made me nervous, but I filed it under "we'll see" instead. I knew too little about what to expect to feel control I'd never had slipping away. They had cores and weren't part of the system. There were going to be surprises no matter what I did. Chris taking to them like a proud uncle was one of the most immediate and least expected surprises on my part. His being fireproof would likely cause problems eventually. For the moment, it was primarily producing adorable results. Hestia, in particular, seemed to take to Chris. A fact that might have had to do with his habit of carrying her around with him everywhere. Buddy and Pounce seemed to like him well enough but were more inclined to gnaw on him than their sister. So, you don't mind? I asked Blackmore. She'd been back to her usual self more or less once she'd given birth and entirely by the day after. We sat on the overlook I'd added to their den, watching Chris and the pups play in the lava field below. He's a good boy. He lets them hunt him, Blackmore replied dismissively. Ahem, I hummed neutrally. They were hounds, and it was a normal thing in its way. I still found it a little weird, but watching the puppies try and track Chris was pretty funny. I'd expected problems when I realized what he was doing. Despite that, he mixed holding back and letting them win with enough difficulty to make it fun. Is Stalin still salty about it? I asked, holding in a laugh. It wasn't that the male hound seemed to have a problem with Chris himself but got jealous easily. Blackmore harumphed at that, which I took as a yes. Not seeing Stalin out trying to join the game or herd the puppies back home, I supposed he was probably sulking somewhere. From what I could tell, he was a good father. The thing was that Chris had opposable thumbs. The ability to carry all the puppies at once or climb up on things to escape them made him a hard act to follow in some ways. I've got some other things to attend to. Anything I can do for you before I go? I asked, giving Blackmore a good scritch behind the ears. Find adventurers strong enough for us to play with, Blackmore replied. She was leaning into the scritch and only half serious, most likely. I didn't doubt the enthusiasm so much as the immediacy of the desire. Blackmore was at her normal energy level again, but her mind was always on the pups. Even when she let Chris or one of the other denizens interact with them, usually me, she always stayed close to observe. Or join in if she wanted some petting too, which she almost always did. "I'll see what I can do," I deflected. Things were coming along, but I was going to wait until the month's end before I started any serious efforts to draw in new adventurers. Alim had finished things in his village, but he still had some personal business to deal with. Since it involved traveling into a more remote area of the earldom, I'd given Alim the month off. There weren't likely to be any adventurers or exciting shopping opportunities. It was better for him to focus on himself and get things done quickly. Andrea was available, but I wasn't going to use her to bait people to their doom. It would likely echo her own experience too closely. I didn't need to damage the little trust I'd built with her. Besides, if I did things with the town right, I should only need to do a little active advertisement to get the flow of adventurers going. "Later, Mama Dog," I said playfully before teleporting into the town. Around me, various skeletons were moving about, some with illusions, others not. All of them more or less mimicked the way mortals would go about their day despite it being sunset. Unlike when I forced myself to come out in daylight, I felt fine. Not perfect, but good enough, and I'd be better once it was fully dark. I wasn't as comfortable as I was in the dungeon proper, but comfortable enough to avoid jumping at every little thing. I'd chosen to appear near the center of the town, close to dawn. We had an appointment to talk about things every couple of days. I could have had something like a town hall meeting, but that felt like overkill for the moment. Most of what I was doing was still centered on layout and waffling together other people's expectations with my preferences when it came to designing. I wasn't going to bend entirely to local expectations or even that of the skeletons. It would be fun at first, but I wasn't the historical accuracy type from what I could tell. I'd get bored of making shit shacks according to low expectations. Balancing that to make something reasonable, though, was something I should do in all fairness. If only so it wouldn't scare people off. "How are things going?" I asked Dawn. She was sitting on the rim of one of the laundry fountains I'd set up, leafing through a crude magazine. The laundry fountain had started as a regular fountain until I realized the skeletons assumed it was for laundry based on the size. Washing wells and associated facilities had been a foreign concept before that revelation. "Well, 42. I've got a list of suggestions for you this time," Dawn replied. She pulled a sheet of paper from the magazine and handed it to me. I was expecting something like suggestions for the design of the town. Instead, I found a list that took me a moment to decipher. "You want a ceremony?" I said happily. The list of party supplies and facilities requests outlined an exciting wedding. "Icarus is quite taken with the idea," Dawn said, looking away from me as if embarrassed. I gave her a shoulder hug. "Excellent. I'll ensure we have everything on the list in time." "When do you want to do it?" I asked. The date was one of the few things not on the list. "The winter solstice," Dawn said quietly. "Dawn, everything all right?" I asked. That might be coming up or already passed since the system calendar didn't tell me. I could work with it regardless, but I didn't think she was hesitant about the date for that reason. "Icarus. He wants to use our traditions, his in the day, mine during the night. Only I don't know of any such for Laminal. She had a consort, but marriage didn't really." Dawn explained hesitantly. I couldn't help but recall how concerned she'd been about her appearance initially. I'd read up on the goddess in question, but it didn't tell me what was or wasn't done regarding daily worship and rituals. "Well, where I'm from, we didn't exactly, the gods were a possibility rather than a given when I lived. So people edited vows, made their own, basically changed things around how they liked," I started. "So, knowing what you do, why not design the ritual yourself and ask for Laminal's approval?" "I've been working on a temple for her and Dulcian as a side project when I ran out of inspiration for Laurel's consort," I asked. I didn't have a solid idea of how it would even work, but it was the only real way to figure out if there was an issue. "A temple for Laminal?" Dawn asked flatly. "Yeah, just the rough in, though. I was going to ask for your input when it was a little further along because I kept moving the location, I explained sheepishly. I'd started with it cut into the side of the valley, but that hadn't sat right with me for long. It was now in a spot on the valley's rim and open air, though I wasn't sure I'd leave it like that. Did you want to see it? I asked. Dawn's quiet told me I'd probably fucked up by not informing her before. I really needed to pay better attention to how things I did would potentially affect others, at least when it came to the big stuff like religion. Yes, mistress, I think I would, Dawn said with a long-suffering sigh. Chapter 128. A Cloak of Night. Mistress, Dawn started, only to fall silent. She'd expected something along the lines of the other temples. Buildings carved into the stone of the valley and heavily decorated. What she found was something else entirely. Intricate arches connected columns of stone. On both were carved the stories of Laminal and her mate, the triple moon god Dalshan. They, in turn, formed an intricate pattern, one of the sacred ones from the few writings Dawn had ever been allowed to see. Mysteries, scrolls, and things like that weren't just sacred. They were precious and always guarded. Here they were woven into the structure of everything, freely seen but kept secret from the uninitiated. 42 hummed. Dawn didn't say anything as she looked up. Night, secrets, chaos, all of those were aspects of Laminal, but she was also the mother of the stars. Above them, hanging in the air were lines of gold and words. As the stars moved through the seasons, they could be named, and constellations created. How? Dawn asked as she gazed upward. It wasn't a completed work, but it was ideal in many ways. Gold embedded in the glass. I marked out a few key stars, but everything can be edited later, 42 replied. Glass. Dawn parroted back. She'd thought she was looking up at the unobstructed night sky. That perhaps the gold lines were an illusion. 42 didn't so much as gesture, and a glass section came down from above. It was a quarter dome in shape and water clear. Dawn knew her mistress could make things well beyond the ability of mortal artisans, but had never considered how it could be used in depth. Her prior masters had also shaped the world to suit them, just never so intricately. Seeing the thick bubble-free glass, she wondered what else 42 might be capable of. Want to look around a while longer or head to the first floor? 42 asked. This isn't the only level. Dawn asked, looking around. From what she could see, the temple was at ground level. I thought it would be a little boring for a goddess of secrets temple not to have a couple of surprises, 42 said and laughed. She gestured at one of the archways, one featuring a stone carving rather than empty. Dawn examined it and, after a few minutes, understood the trick. 42 has installed a dungeon puzzle in the temple. A teleportation circle glowed to life on the floor when the puzzle was solved. Stepping onto it, Dawn found herself inside a large chamber with nothing but chalk on the floor. 42 was only a moment behind her in appearing. This part isn't finished because I was eventually going to consult you about it. I just got carried away with the topside part, 42 explained. We're under the glass temple? Dawn asked. She got a nod from 42 in reply. Yeah. I was thinking of setting up a maze here. One with chambers that connect to various parts in the temple like the one you used, 42 explained, gesturing to the chalk lines. So if you know what you're doing, you can take shortcuts to some parts. If you don't, though, kind of a mini dungeon to keep intruders out. Dawn nodded, not in agreement but with simple acknowledgement. She'd expected a few statues and maybe some of the odd books 42 made sometimes. Copies of the system's encyclopedia entries as she'd named them. There was almost nothing about how the servants of Laminal themselves lived. That gave me a kind of wandering order impression, so I thought a monastery setup wouldn't be appropriate, 42 continued. Tell me if I'm wrong, but I thought a couple of chambers for the temple's keeper and some acolytes and the odd wandering member or pilgrim would probably do the job, 42 said, rambling a bit. Dawn realized that she hadn't spoken in some time. She'd been absorbing that she was being spoken to, but that was all. Just a temple keeper and a few acolytes would be more than enough. Others can stay in the valley or sleep on the floor. The ones where I was from were just stone altars in fields, and we'd camp by them, Dawn explained. They'd also bury any valuables in stone vaults sealed with wax to try and keep them safe. Of course, it didn't always work, but they tried and usually could salvage things enough to make copies if worse came to worst. The high priestesses had been the ones who tended the altars and vaults, most often alone but occasionally with an apprentice. Dawn had wandered between such places in the company of an elder sister once she was taken from her mother. The road had been hard, and they'd sold their services to others as much to survive as to honor Laminal. "How will people come here?" Dawn asked. Laminal was respected as a goddess mainly because it was known that she would retaliate fiercely against those who harassed her clergy. That did not, however, endear her to many. It was why her worship was done in the wilds, away from any village or town respected but unwelcomed. "Follow me," 42 said, sounding excited. She seemed to swim through the air. Her dark form slipped between and combined with the shadows around them in hypnotic ways as she led Dawn to an archway. Once she stepped through, Dawn found herself on a small terrace just off the side of a staircase cut into the mountain's stone. Looking back toward the arch, she found it gone, nothing but rough stone greeting her. "As I said, I can't make it boring. The stairs start in the valley and lead up to the glass temple. There are a couple of other rest stops like this on the way up," 42 explained. She led Dawn up the stairs, which would take a mortal a long while to climb. Her mistress moved them to the top, so Dawn was treated to a clear view of the valley below. "I'll need to mess with it, but I was thinking about making it a full day's walk to get up here. Like if you start at sunrise, you'll reach it at sunset, for effect," 42 explained. Dawn could picture it, supplicants and the curious alike beginning the ascent. It would be relatively comfortable. The stairs would never be narrow or steep. 42 wouldn't even think to make something that wasn't a trap uncomfortable on purpose. Despite its comfort, it would be a long journey. The only real reward at its end would be the satisfaction of one's curiosity. "I'm going to spend the night here and pray for my goddess's guidance," Dawn said after a few moments. "Hope she likes it," 42 said, sounding nervous. A goddess forced into the fields not enjoying such a gift was absurd, but Dawn understood 42 was sincere. She took her strange and slightly dense mistress into a shoulder hug. Chapter 129. Setting out. Alim knew there were worse things in the world than sitting in an open carriage, particularly the one he happened to be in. The carriage was odd, with an open top and a tent-like cover spread over metal frames that could be raised if they wanted shade. It was one of Mistress 42's inventions. It rode smoother than any other carriage Alim had ever seen, and the padded bench seats were comfortable. If not for the jingle of the tack keeping Alim from a nap, it might well have been pleasant. It was a warm, beautiful day, and Tiller had rested her head on his shoulder while she spied through Storm's eyes. Really, if his mother, Erica, would stop looking over approvingly, all would have been right with the world. Alim kept his dissatisfaction to himself. The only thing sillier than his blushing over nothing would have been complaining about it. His mother would have laughed at him for it, and he'd have deserved it. Uninterested in the adults, Bess was having the best time watching the countryside roll by from her grandmother's lap. As if realizing it had an audience, the forest was in rare form. Flowers, butterflies, rabbits, every pretty thing was present and accounted for. "Can we have wabbit for dinner?" Bess asked excitedly. She'd traded a tooth scraping with some village kids for a lisp. The kids back in Selton knew better than to pick a fight with her. The boy who'd pulled her hair had learned. Alim followed his daughter's line of sight and found a fat rabbit ambling in the grass. As if wolves and wild cats were a foreign concept locally. "That's a monster," Tiller said as she sat up. Alim offered her lemon candy, and she accepted it gratefully. Switching perspectives played havoc with her stomach. Really? Erica asked in surprise. It's got little horns. Still tastes good, just harder to catch since they fight back, Tiller explained. Alim couldn't see the horns but knew better than to question Tiller on the point. She'd been scouting the area through Storm's eyes. The demonic hawks were sharper than even a natural bird of the same kind. I'm not surprised. This whole area is rich in magic. We'll probably see other things like it, Alim added. He'd been practicing using his mega size and had a handle on the basics. Elementals and monsters were attracted to and fed on mana, so where it was thick was where they would gather. Not that either was entirely stuck in one place. Monsters could get by eating other creatures and roaming where they liked. Elementals couldn't unless they formed a core, but once they did, all bets were off. Things he'd learned courtesy of 42 and was glad to know. Should we expect trouble? Graham asked from the driver's bench. He was one of the 4 men Alim had hired to help with moving. Graham, Sven, August, and Tim were all former Savix soldiers Alim had met during his service. Graham had a bad leg after a break was set poorly. He'd been keen on finding work outside the infantry when Alim showed up. Sven, August, and Tim had all been in similar situations. They were injured enough that soldiering as they once had wasn't easy and likely would become impossible before long. A problem that wasn't uncommon for ex-soldiers. Alim could have had a regiment worth of men if he'd felt like hunting around for them. He'd picked the 4 because he knew them better than most, and they'd lived close to Selton. Now they were riding behind the carriage in a wagon. Nothing serious before nightfall. We'll be at our stop or the next town before then, Tiller offered. Graham nodded, taking her word since he knew she was a scout. True to Tiller's estimate, a few wispy plumes of smoke in the distance gave away that the small caravan was approaching a town. Their destination lay before it, along a side road. Turning off the main road, it wasn't long before another plume of smoke appeared. Graham, hold here, Alim said as a bead of sweat rolled down his back. He'd been expecting an abandoned estate, not an occupied one. Graham signaled the stop to the wagon and then did as he was ordered. He watched Alim get down from the carriage but didn't ask why. He'd been hired as a driver and laborer, but travel came with unpredictable dangers. Intentions aside, some fighting along the way was expected. Tiller, take a look. Alim asked softly enough that even his mother wouldn't overhear, let alone Graham. She nodded, then changed her position to lay on the bench. Trouble? Sven asked when Alim walked over. Hopefully not, but I see smoke, Alim explained. Erica had left home over 16 years prior. Her father, the old baronet, had eventually died a few years after that. So the place should have been empty unless squatters had taken up residence. Sven, August? Do you mind coming with me? Alim asked. He was already opening a small chest of weapons, and when the men agreed, he handed them spears and bucklers. They already had short swords belted on, but they'd been trained with spears primarily. They just weren't practical to have out in a moving wagon, so they'd been put up in the unlocked chest, still in easy reach. Alim considered the sight of the men he'd hired gearing up. They weren't people he felt close to, but soldiers had an essential camaraderie even when they hated each other. He was a fighter now rather than a warrior, but seeing them getting ready for a fight without complaint was reassuring. Alim didn't want trouble and didn't intend to start any. Still, working for House Savix had taught him it was always best to come well armed and in force to ensure that. While Sven and August were getting ready, Alim headed back to the wagon. Tiller was sitting up, meaning she'd finished at least basic recon. Standing next to it, Alim found himself in the interesting position of having Tiller lean over the side to whisper to him this time. Looks like 15 folks. Men, women, and kids. Lightly armed, mostly tools, going about chores, Tiller explained softly. She knew better than to think a tool wasn't a weapon but to make the distinction for reference. She also had hazel eyes that were unfairly pretty up close. All right. Stay with them, please? Alim asked, looking away in hopes she wouldn't see him blush. They hadn't talked properly, but he'd already gone back on his word about sending Tiller off when his family left Sultan. She hadn't brought it up either in the week since. Instead, while they were on the road, she'd bedded down with his mother and Bess as if she'd always been there. Course, Tiller said. She stood up, lifting the seat to get at the crossbow and spears stored under it. Erica, by contrast, laid down, looking a bit annoyed but otherwise fine. Bess squirmed to get comfortable in her grandmother's arms. They'd discussed safety before, and that meant getting low. Gram, get turned around and head for the town. The rest of us will catch up with you there once we know what's happening, Alim said. Sven and August joined him a few moments later, and they watched the wagon and carriage set off the way they'd come before they started walking. How we doin' this, boss? August asked. We see who's there quietly. If it's not bandits, I'll talk with them, friendly-like, while you two wait in case of trouble, Alim explained. Tiller had already looked things over, but they didn't tell him who the people were or their intentions. If they ain't friendly? Sven asked. I back off. If they don't want to let me, you help me convince them to, and we run for it, Alim said with a shrug. He wasn't about to get into a scrap over the house, but he wanted to understand the situation before he did anything drastic like ask for the local militia's help. He didn't know them personally, and there were women and kids involved. Fair, Sven said with a shrug. All of them were soldiers, but none of them were inclined to start a needless fight. They'd all seen enough death to know how easily it happened, no matter how well prepared you thought you were. Creeping up on the manor, Alim was a bit surprised. It was a large two-story building in good condition. The roof was intact, and the paint wasn't even peeling. Squatters didn't usually maintain things so well as that. Weird, August offered. Alim had told the men what he expected to find when he hired them. This wasn't it at all. Little bit, Alim agreed. They kept creeping through the woods surrounding the yard until they could see into the back lot. That's where things got properly strange. Like Tiller had said, a mass of people was going about their chores. It looked like a small village at work, and they were all dressed rather well. The adults, in particular, had a green article of clothing, such as an apron or vest. Most of those even had grey trees embroidered on them. It was livery. The entire lot of them were wearing Silvertree livery. Chapter 130. Lost Son. Beg your pardon, an unfamiliar voice called out. Tanner looked toward it and found a blonde-haired young man standing near the trees. One wearing a sword, but it was thankfully sheathed. He wiped the blood from the blade he'd been bleeding a goose with and put it aside. The bloody apron came off next and he rinsed his hand for good measure. The young man didn't look noble, but he had to be someone carrying an expensive weapon like that. Everyone else had halted in what they were doing but didn't move. They were waiting on Tanner to decide how to approach things. Something he was grateful for, as he didn't need a panic on his hands. The young man in turn waited placidly at the edge of the yard, which suggested someone had raised him with manners. "Hello, I'm Tanner." "Who might you be, young man?" Tanner asked. Up close he found the young man well dressed in that the clothes were well made and new looking, but otherwise unremarkable. "Tanner Leeds, the steward," the young man asked, sticking out a hand to shake. Tanner accepted on instinct and found his hand in a firm, but not painful grip and his arm being pumped enthusiastically. "Been a long time since I was called that," Tanner said, unable to help a laugh. The old baronet was 6 years dead and with him had gone any titles more definitive than boss or chief. They even called the old headmaid Bossy as a nickname now, amused rather than fearful of the stern old thing. "My mother told me about you," the young man said cheerfully. "I'm Alim Gray, Erica's son by Castor." Tanner didn't have time to so much as think before his mouth was falling open in shock. "Lady Erica?" Tanner asked, feeling like he was floating. That was a name he hadn't even thought of in years. Tanner barely registered it as everyone around him rushed forward to swarm Alim with questions. Tanner though couldn't think of any and just kept looking the young man over. At least until his eyes found the engraving on the crossguard of the young man's sword. A yellow rose with red arrows behind it. It looked much nicer, he'd clearly had the enamel refreshed, but that was Castor's blade and none but his son would have it. Before Alim could say much of anything, Tanner grabbed the young man in a bear hug. Alim Gray, son of Erica Silvertree. Tanner roared, then he and the others lifted Alim up. Hey now! Alim complained, even as he laughed. By some unknown agreement, the mob brought him to the outdoor table they took their meals at in warm weather. They set him in the place of honor and offered the best of everything they had. Is Lady Erica well? Bossy asked, looking on the edge of tears. Perfectly, ma'am. She was a bit sick when she was younger, I heard, but I guess the air in Selton agreed with her because she got better, Alim offered. Bossy really did start crying at that. Erica hadn't been frail, but she'd take sick easily and they'd all worried after her. Most of them had actually thought she might not live long past bearing her first child. Even healthy women might not survive that. Is she still in Selton? Oisian, the former coachman asked. Like most of the servants who'd chosen to remain, his original profession was long discarded. They hadn't been able to afford to keep the coach with no one to ride in it, it had been sold to pay for upkeep and get a more useful cart. That she is, sir. I came with a few hired hands who are in the village waiting on me. I wanted to see how things were, fix the house up, before having her follow, Alim explained. No need for that, young master, Tanner said, laughing. Young master? Mister, I'm just Alim, my granddad took the title with him. I do appreciate everything you've all been doing though, Alim explained. You'll be moving back then, you and Lady Erica? Oisian asked. He'd said it in a neutral tone, but Tanner didn't really like it. Alim wasn't insisting on formalities, but Oisian hadn't been looking at him with any kind of respect. Eventually. Our house in Selton's rather comfortable, so I'll need to make sure everything's ready before sending for her, Alim replied. True, we've kept everything clean, but plenty of it's mended a few times over by now, Tanner acknowledged. Getting new linens wouldn't be that hard, at least not if Alim let them sell some timber or the like first. The property wasn't big, but it had its decent resources. What about your father, the knight? When's he come in? Oisian asked. Tanner glared at the man, finding that flat out rude. Dropping a title after being asked to was one thing, referring to Sir Grey in such a fashion was entirely another. Oisian, go do something useful if you can't remember how to speak politely, Tanner cut in. Oisian scoffed, but then held his hands up placatingly. He slinked off and more polite questions resumed from those actually interested in the family's welfare. Enough, enough. Let the lad have some room to breathe, Tanner declared as lunch approached. People dispersed briefly, but soon returned with food. The spread was simple but filling once it was served and brought a respite from questions. After the meal, Alim gave a more coherent rundown of exactly what had happened. Tanner wasn't surprised to find out Erica wasn't actually pregnant when she was thrown out. That the lad was definitely Castor's was a relief nonetheless. Being a knight's son was preferable to being Lyndon Savix's bastard for a number of reasons. Castor having passed was sad news, but the world was a hard place. It was good that Alim had looked after his family once his father was gone, and best that they'd all return to the estate now that they could. Tanner didn't know the finer points of the law, but he suspected it wouldn't be hard for the young man to claim the property and then things could be kept in better order. Would you like a tour of the house and property? Carl, a former forester, asked once the table was clear. I'd be much obliged, Alim said cheerfully. I'll take you through the house, then Carl can show you the property, Tanner offered. The house had several rooms on the main floor, while the second story was a single room. Rather fancy really, but Alim commented more on it being clean rather than marveling at the woodworking. He seemed practical, which Tanner liked. "This the baronet's office then?" Alim asked, as they came to the only door with a lock on it. "Yes, we've kept it up, but haven't looked through things since he passed," Tanner explained. The tour of the office took a little longer than the other rooms as Alim took a moment to familiarize himself with where the various documents and ledgers were stored. "I'll do a proper look-through of everything tomorrow," Alim said as they left. "Then we'll survey the property itself." "These are yours now," Tanner said as he offered Alim a ring of keys. There were only 6 on the ring. The office, stables, root cellar, and storehouses were the only ones that had locks. "I don't think I'll have much need for them. You've been doing a fine job with the place. I'll ask you if I need something," Alim said as he declined with a smile. Tanner was touched and accepted the refusal for the moment. The property wasn't particularly large, but sizable enough that the tour took most of the rest of the day. Dinner preparations were well underway by the time Alim, Tanner, and Carl were back. Dinner passed pleasantly and afterward Alim joined Tanner and some of the others for drinks on the back porch of the manor. It was the only part of it they ever used casually, but that had been permitted even when the baronet was alive. "Not what you were expecting, I take it?" Carl asked with a chuckle. "No sir," Alim replied lazily. They'd all been drinking for a while and the atmosphere was pleasant. "I'd like to say we were keeping it ready for you, but really I think we didn't know what else to do. There aren't any other estates in this area and the new baronet wasn't appointed until last year," Carl explained. Tanner wanted to refute it but, as unflattering as it was true. They'd all have been adrift and homeless had they left when the baronet died. Staying on to manage the property had been a default action rather than a conscious choice. There were more of us at first, the original servants. People drifted off as they found other work, then the numbers grew again as those who stayed had families, Tanner added. If they were going to be honest, they might as well not do it by half measures. "Makes sense, and I can't imagine it was easy. So thank you for that," Alim said simply. People started heading back to their rooms in the servants' quarters until it was just Tanner, Oisian, and Alim. "I'll get your room ready," Tanner offered. "Thank you, I appreciate it," Alim said with a smile. Tanner left and quiet descended over the porch for a few minutes. "I've got some harder stuff, if you'd like," Oisian offered, holding out his flask. "I would, thank you," Alim replied, taking a swig before offering it back. Oisian waved him off. "You're not really what I thought a young nobleman would be like. Figured you'd come back in full of contempt and demands, probably ordering people about," Oisian admitted. "Might taught me how to use a sword and my mother manners, but I was just another peasant kid. Did a stint in the Earl's army since I wasn't much of a farmer," Alim said without apparent offense taken. He'd told the story already but didn't mind repeating it. "What do you plan to do with all of us?" "Most of us were free servants but there are some serfs and such," Oisian asked. A serf and their child were both serfs, hereditary servants bound to the land and its ruler. Just another word for slave really. "Shit, well that ends in the morning. My granddad disowned my mother, but if he didn't do the paperwork she's not legally disinherited and I'll dissolve the contracts. Even if he did, since the title is inactive I can probably do something," Alim said after a moment. Oisian was taken aback. One of the quickest ways to make money would have been to sell the serfs and he'd thought the young man would do just that. "Ah, shit. I'm honestly sorry," Oisian said, as he watched Alim take another drink. It was too late, it had been from the first drink, but he still reached over and took it back. "'Bout what?" Alim asked, blinking slowly. My wife's a serf. It didn't matter before, but then the new baronet was appointed. He wants the house and said he'd free her if I could find the title and things for it. If I didn't he'd still get it eventually only he'd hurt her." "Fuck, the flask was poisoned," Oisian admitted. "Why poison me?" Alim asked. I was told to, if any of the Silverleafs ever turned up. The Baronet will kill us if I don't, Oisian admitted. He was genuinely surprised by the fact Alim was able to keep talking, but he wasn't a poison expert. He'd been told the poison was quick and the victim would fall unconscious first, then just die eventually. He clearly should have asked how long it would take. Well, shit, Alim said with a sigh. He stood up and Oisian took a fearful step back. He hadn't been happy about doing it, but he'd made sure he brought the right flask. Alim should have been fighting to keep his eyes open, not advancing on him. Oisian thought about calling for help, but didn't bother. He wasn't going to get out of this, he hadn't brought a weapon. He was spared having to wonder exactly what would happen by a fist connecting with his jaw. Chapter 131. Complications. Alim was up with the sun, having let Sven and Augustus into the manor in the evening after he dealt with Oisian. A situation that had quite nearly gotten out of hand as Tanner had wanted to kill the man on the spot. Instead, he was manacled and locked in the root cellar. You really don't want to give justice yet? Tanner asked over breakfast. Alim was taking it in the office while he went over records. He's a witness to a conspiracy. He'll hang for trying to poison me, but not before he testifies, Alim explained. Even if he agrees to, will it matter? One servant's word against a baronet? Tanner asked, understandably confused. Oh, believe me, Earl Savik's won't mind. I've seen a baron hanged on the word of a scullery maid, Alim said with a chuckle. That was a fond memory for him from early on in the tax escort mission that ultimately brought him to 42's Valley. The man had been treating his servants atrociously and the poor girl had heard gossip he was evading import taxes and reported it. Alim had no idea how, but the Earl had ways of telling if someone was lying. It was one of the reasons that the lesser nobles closer to him geographically tended to be extremely careful. If they ended up questioned, there wasn't any telling what misdeeds might be brought to light under questioning. Besides, I'm seeing a good case for it happening even without that, unless I've overlooked where the more recent tax records are somehow, Alim added. The tax records starting 2 years after Alim's grandfather died were missing. A truly odd thing to happen since they weren't valuable. Nobody would normally bother protecting them. Ledgers were normally the thing people guarded as they might reveal a past or ongoing crime. When Tanner had been out of the room, Alim had put everything into the inventory, including the locked safe with a missing key. One of 42's monsters had sorted that out in a couple of minutes. Unless things had been hidden, he had all of the significant documents already. He'd even double-checked the office's small library, in case they'd been mishelved, to no avail. That's because the collectors didn't come round. At least not like they should have. Occasionally they'd come round and ask for timber or something, but that was all, and they didn't issue receipts, Tanner said. That's odd, the local viscount would be in charge of that, Alim said, unamused. Having escorted the tax collectors, he knew a bit more about the subject than the average soldier. An estate was an estate. With the baronet dead, the next noble up would have handled collection, which was the local viscount. Trade wasn't accepted for tax payment, the estate should have been informed of the amount and given time to sell timber to meet the requirement rather than the viscount accepting goods in trade. It made transitions easier to track for the Earl. Well, problems for later. I want to meet Oisian's wife and the other serfs before I head into town, Alim said. He had a list of things to address and daylight was burning. He was halfway to the office door when he realized Tanner wasn't following him. That's only in name. A serf can't, please don't be hard on her for what he's done, Tanner said, stumbling. Alim took a moment to process what he'd heard. He'd forgotten, but a serf couldn't marry without express permission of the landowner. Worst I'll do is ask her a couple of questions, Alim said flatly. He understood why Tanner was worried but wasn't about to explain himself further, no more than he would take offense. The only real way to prove himself in this case was simply to do as he said he would. The walk to the small cluster of houses the serfs used took a little while since it was past the servants' quarters. It had been omitted from the prior day's tour, but so had the servants' quarters outside of a passing mention as they walked by. He was curious if Karl was trying to be polite to the residents or something else. Alim hadn't been expecting anything fancy and the earth berm houses weren't, but they were reasonably weatherproof. Nobody was likely to die in winter and there was a well. One he dropped a purification stone into on principle. He always kept a couple of them in a pocket, paranoia born of watching more than one body of water he considered clean turn out to be anything but. The scent of burning sage caught Alim first. To him, that was the scent of sickness, as the ill often burned it in hopes of clearing the air of whatever had made them ill. How long have these people been ill? Alim asked. Ill? Tanner looked genuinely confused as he stopped. Somewhere nearby there was a sound of a man heaving. Go back to the main estate, check everyone, Alim said. For what? Tanner asked, voice betraying a bit of fear. Alim plastered on a smile and clapped the older man on the shoulder. Anything, it's probably just a cold, but no sense in letting it get out of hand. Anyone who's even a little sick goes on rest and everyone else puts on a kettle of soup. I'll look around here myself because I've already had the worst the season had to offer, Alim said like the prior tension hadn't existed. Really? Tanner asked. What else is there to do? It's what we do for our neighbors in Selton, what they did for my ma when she caught blue veins, Alim offered. Right, that's a good way to handle it, Tanner said, looking relieved. Did that pass through here by the way? Blue veins? Came through with the cold this year, Alim asked. A few months back, yeah. Nearly killed Karl but he pulled through, the rest of us only got the cold, Tanner explained. Lucky then, Alim said, smiling still. Have some blankets cleaned and soup made up for these folks too. I will, you're a good lad Alim, Tanner said with a relieved smile. Thank you kindly. How many people live here anyway? Just to make sure I check in on everyone, Alim asked. Just 10 with the kids, Tanner said. Alim's heart was in his boots at that, but Tanner was already turning to leave thankfully. Alim was already texting 42. Mistress. I think there might be full-blown bloody mana fever here. Someone caught blue veins a few months back and the others got sick but not that. Will the potion work still and may I please have enough to treat everyone? Your servant. Alim Gray. Alim didn't have to wait long and with the reply text came a glut of potion bottles into the inventory. That was a blunt answer in its own right. 42 would help and going by the lack of a contract window it wasn't going to cost him anything extra. Alim. That probably is what's happening. Not sure if the potion will work once it reaches the critical stage but you can't get it so go ahead and try giving it to them. I've put a bunch in the inventory. -42. Alim heard the wailing of an infant and instinctively looked toward the sound. He didn't know if he had a cure in hand or not, but it was more than anyone else would have been able to do. Something available to him only because of 42. It wasn't easy to trust the strange dungeon master, but Alim believed that she'd at least abide by any agreements made, both in spirit and word. He paused long enough to write a reply before heading in the direction of the crying. He needed to get to work. Mistress. Can my family come stay with you? Regards. Alim. Chapter 132. Family Matters. Alim wasn't worried about catching anything, so he walked among the serf families without fear. Since Tanner had obligingly left, he didn't have to worry about getting caught as he took liberally from the inventory. As he went to the first house, a basket of food and spiked mead was on his arm. The first woman he treated, Lyra, was in a bad way. She had a new baby in the crib and couldn't even get out of bed, though not for want of trying. She didn't want the mead, tired from throwing up, but Alim got her to drink it anyway. Lyra threw up again right after, but to Alim's relief, it was a lesser version of the putrid mess his mother had rather than pure bile. A sure sign the potion had done its job, and she held down the next one he gave her, a blue 142 said would help her recover faster. Alim treated the baby, muttering some soothing lies about food poisoning as he did. Nobody at the manor was a cleric or any sort of mage, so they wouldn't know the difference. Food poisoning and seasonal fevers killed plenty of people, after all. The difference was those weren't as contagious and wouldn't result in a purge. It was nearly noon by the time Alim sorted everyone out. All of the serfs had been sick. Only 2 of the manor servants had been ill, but everyone had caught the flu before. So it would have only been a matter of time until the rest sickened. Task done, he retreated to the outdoor cooking area. I didn't realize Jacob had taken ill, Tanner muttered as lunch approached. Alim nodded, forced only to observe while everyone else made soup. He'd wanted to help and been unceremoniously told no. It's easy to overlook at first, Alim said with a shrug. Since the manor itself wasn't in use, everyone on the property was used to keeping a relaxed schedule. So someone taking a day or 2 off wasn't something worthy of comment. I'll be heading into town, but I'll be back in a few days. Keep everyone that's ill on bed rest for 2 or 3 days more, just to be sure, he added. We will, but are you sure you don't want to ride? The cart's really not so bad, Tanner asked. Nah, I can use the walk, Alim lied with a grin. He had August and Sven join everyone for lunch and had them stay at the manor when he left. Once Alim felt confident nobody would see him, he took a horse complete with saddle out of the inventory. He made good time, but wasn't surprised Storm found him before he reached the caravan. The foul-mouthed bird tried to shit on him, but he was expecting it and dodged it narrowly. Fuck you too, Alim grumbled half-heartedly. He would never like Storm after what he'd said about Bess, but Alim wasn't one to expend energy on hatred. So instead, he followed after as the bird led him to where his family was. Alim. What happened? Erica asked in worry. She was looking past him for the 2 men who were still at the manor, likely misunderstanding their absence. Everything's all right. It's just a bit of a story, Alim laughed nervously. Explaining what had happened took little time, mainly because Alim knew relatively little. The local nobles being shady fuckers wasn't particularly surprising to anyone. Alim left out the bloody mana fever issue. He had included the men he'd hired for the basic explanation. They deserved to be aware of the situation and make their own choices about staying or going. The rest he could relay to Tiller and his mother later. They all stayed on? Erica asked in astonishment. That had caught her interest, though she'd kept it to herself until Alim was finished with his story. Yeah, Ma. They were excited to learn you were all right, Alim relayed. It was the happiest bit of news he had to offer. Erica nodded, eyes a little damp with emotion, while she hugged Bess tightly to her. Tiller stood off to the side, contemplative. Tiller, what do you make of it? Alim asked. Tiller knew at least as much as Alim did about the penalties for tax evasion and the Earl's brutality. If we looked at a tree of lineage for the Viscount, we'd find the new baronet is a relative if not one of their kids. Territorial embezzlement is usually managed in-house, Tiller said, then spat as if to ward away evil. The other ex-soldiers joined her, and Alim did too when Bess wasn't looking. Hadn't thought of that, but it's true, Alim agreed. His mind had primarily been set on figuring out what to do next, rather than working out the odd little puzzle with the taxes. Ma. Do you want the house? Alim asked. It was the single sticking point for all of his possible plans. His mother hadn't spoken of her old life fondly, but that didn't mean she might not want part of it back, particularly since her bastard father was dead. She could be the lady of the Silvertree family again and do as she saw fit. Anyone who wanted to get in the way of that would be answering to Alim directly. Gods no, boy. It was trouble when I was a girl, and I'm not back even 2 days, and it's trouble again, Erica said and snorted in disbelief. Tiller laughed discreetly, seeming to approve of Erica's view of the matter. All right, Alim agreed, feeling a flood of relief where there had only been tension before. Back to Sultan then? Graham asked. He didn't sound put out at the prospect of turning tail and running. Alim suspected that had more to do with his pay being guaranteed already than trepidation about the baronet or even the viscount. Where next is a discussion I'll be having with my family, but you'll know before the day's out. If it's not Sultan, I'll make an offer to keep you all on, but I'll understand if you don't want to travel further, Alim explained. Right then, Graham said. He moved to give the family privacy, and the others followed him. Tiller moved to follow suit, but Alim caught her by the shoulder. Funny, Alim muttered when Tiller gave him a questioning look. She settled in against the side of the carriage, looking rather pleased, but not even half so smug as Alim's mother. When Alim was reasonably sure nobody was close enough to see or overhear anything, he rummaged in his pockets. The move was a front. He was pulling an item from the inventory, but it didn't hurt to be careful. So, it's a bit far, but there's a place I'd like you to consider moving to, Alim started. He'd opened a folded-up drawing of the house in 42's Valley, the one she'd sent him absurdly tempting pictures of not so long ago. It's pretty, Erica said diplomatically as she looked over the drawing. Alim couldn't do more than nod. The paper had an ink drawing of the house and then layouts of the floors, of which there were 2. Having never seen architectural drawings before, he didn't know if they were good from a technical perspective. As art, though, they were lovely. And it's ours if you want it, Alim said. His mother looked at him suspiciously, and rightfully so. Nothing was ever free. Not really. What, is it haunted? Tiller asked with a smirk. No, not haunted, Alim replied. He was reasonably confident that the local skeleton population didn't constitute a haunting. Technically. Is it currently on fire, then? Erica asked. It's in Mistress 42's territory, Alim admitted. There would never be a good moment to say it, so saying it quickly was better than letting it drag out. Son, did you hit your head when I wasn't looking? Erica asked, looking confused and offended. Tiller just let out an affronted huff. It sounds horrible, but it's really. Let me show you the contract, Alim said. He withered a bit under the gaze of all 3 females as Bess had decided to join in. He doubted she knew why Erica and Tiller were glaring, but it was something to do. They all ended up in the carriage with the sunshade drawn up so no one else could accidentally see the interface window. Alim had gotten used to the strange glowing bit of nothing that displayed words. Tiller and his mother took a few moments to compose themselves after the initial shock. On the other hand, Bess was having fun batting at it and watching her hand go through unresisted. So, for all the other possible faults involved, 42 won't hurt you, Alim offered after Tiller and his mother finished reading. Bess was disappointed to see the glowy thing disappear, but Alim promised to let her play with it again another time. I think she'll be a gracious host if anything, he added. Why's that? Erica asked, sounding less than impressed. She's mentioned that she wants people to live there. Something about attracting adventurers to the dungeon, Alim admitted. Oh, so we'd be bait, Erica said, a brow raised. I mean, yes. Alim said, since there was no way of getting around it. For all the faults one might point out with a house in a valley ruled by a dungeon master, Alim felt like it was the best option. His family would unquestionably be safe and very well taken care of. 42 was a strange creature, but one who had to abide by her deals.